Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me here. I'm glad to be here, and I gotta tell you, I'm a little nervous with this whole Zoom thing. Is a whole nother layer of things that could go wrong. But I'm gonna turn off my video for my presentation so I don't distract myself. And I will pull up my PowerPoint here with a little luck. And if you can't hear me, please interrupt me. Sometimes my computer doesn't pick up the sound well. So today I'm going to talk to you about common grass species on the Kenai Peninsula and some invasive lookalikes that you may run into. I know that grasses are not everybody's favorite thing to identify, but we'll see if we can make things a little bit easier for some of the species anyway. The important thing to know is some terminology when you're identifying grasses. And just the very basics are to identify that you've got a grass. You know through a round stem that's hollow and jointed. The leaf venation is linear and it's got a flower. It's atypical, but it is pretty conspicuous. And grasses are classified based on their flowers. And so it's important to know some of these terms to be able to identify grasses. And the important ones are here. The floret is a really important part of identifying a grass. Inside, we've got two little, almost like containers, almost like canoes that are folded into each other. And inside there is the actual flower, the stigma, style, ovary, the anthers, the stamen. Oh, I'm sorry. And then they've got an initial protective coating, that's the palea, and another on the outside of that one, which is the lemma. And those together are the floret. Now, we also classify these flowers as being a spikelet. A spikelet includes these things called glooms. So a spikelet can have one floret with glooms, or it can have multiple florets with glooms. So if you can kind of keep that in mind, that's good to know. And then another characteristic that's used quite a bit in identifying grasses is the ligule. It's like the collar where the leaf comes off the stem. The inflorescence, panicle, it's the seed head. It all means the same thing. It's all of the spikelets collectively on the grass. Rhizomes are pretty important for this talk in particular. It's the underground runner that plants will connect and spread out with and reproduce with. And so the facts are that grass identification is hard, and that's why people don't generally like to identify them. It's based on the flowers, like I mentioned. So if you have the flower, it's going to be hard. But if you don't have the flower, it's going to be really, really hard to maybe almost impossible. So some of the plants that I'm going to go over, some of these grasses we're going to touch on, are listed below. And I'm just going to kind of go through them one by one, talk about the similarities to other species you might run into, and maybe some ideas for identifying them. So first we'll talk about this squirrel tail. It's pretty identifiable just by looking at it. It's flat, and it's got long awns that are almost reddish a lot of the time. So it's pretty distinguishable. It doesn't grow in big patches or big monocultures. It'll grow here and there, single stems, but it's pretty common. And in the fall, you might not recognize it right away, but the panicle will shatter, as you can see here, and the bottom florets are left, the bottom spikelets are left, and they're pretty pokey, pretty hard. The awns, which are these long structures, hair-like structures, they get pretty hard, and that's part of its dispersal. This one is another hordeum also, Foxtail Barley. It's a native species. It's not particularly loved by producers of hay or grazing animals. It's got long awns that are pretty uniform in direction in the way that they grow. Some people think it's a kind of a pretty grass. It can maybe turn reddish also, and is photographed quite often. It's a short grass. and it has those awns that they are sharp and they can get into animals' mouths and cause abscesses and problems. So this one is kind of a look-alike to that previous plant, but it's an invasive, and this is one we really want to look out for. Cheatgrass is its common name, and probably a lot of you know all about it. It's got long awns and a droopy panicle like the one before, but you can see this panicle on this plant is more uniform, whereas the panicle here is kind of going in all kinds of different directions, kind of like it has bedhead. It's droopy, it's got long awns. It is not a nice plant. It's an annual and has changed much of the ecology in the western United States. So it's not common here in Alaska, but it has been spotted, and so it's a good one to keep an eye out for. Smooth brome is another one. It's introduced. It's a common forage and pasture grass planted, not so much here on the Kenai Peninsula, but a lot more in the Mat-Su Valley and in Fairbanks. It's got several florets per spikelet, as you can see. It's got a W on the leaf, a pinched area, and that's a really good indicator that you've got smooth brome. It's got a soft leaf that is not erect. It's drooping a little bit. It's kind of a soft looking grass. The panicle is open, so you're likely to see this in agricultural areas. Fairbanks, I understand it is causing some problems up there, maybe spreading it into areas that have been burned. So this is loved by some and hated by others, I guess, the smooth brome. Tends to usually not have awns or has short awns. This Timothy is a very common forage plant here on the Kenai Peninsula, especially up in Kenai Soldotna area. It's a hay grass that was cultivated and planted, and it looks similar to some other species. So the best way to identify this Timothy is by the spike head that it's got, but also if you pull off one floret, you'll see it has, these are actually two glooms and they're on, but it kind of looks like a T, or maybe kind of forms a bit of a V. And that is very different from this Alpicurus. So it looks very similar, and in some stages it has tricked me when I did not look closely. So you really got to look close at this one, but its floret is more of an A-shaped. It doesn't have that forked shape on the floret. We do have a native Timothy, an alpine Timothy. It's got a much smaller head, maybe an inch long, whereas this could be 4 or 5 inches long. And it's found at higher elevations. So this Alpicurus Foxtail Barley, meadow foxtail, excuse me, has very early seed heads. So this is one that we see around Homer, and it'll seed out along the roadsides in May. That's why a lot of the hay producers like it, especially at higher elevations down here in Homer. It's been planted for their hay field. There is a native Alpicurus as well. It's found in wet soils or even growing in water. It's quite a bit smaller, and I think you'd recognize that it's not the same thing if you saw it. Quack grass. Quack grass is one that we want to watch out for. It's introduced. It's a pretty nasty weed. Once it gets established, it's really hard to impossible to control if it's really gone all over. This is up in the Mat-Su Valley, and it's very common up there. It reproduces primarily or strongly by these rhizomes, and it's underground runners. And when I was up there looking at some pasture, I dug a hole with a shovel, and the shovel went down about, 2.5 inches and bounced. It bounced off the layer of rhizomes. It was impressive, the network that goes on under the ground. It looks similar to another plant that we've got that we'll touch on. If you'll notice how the way that the seed heads are turned, the spikelets are turned, and how they're arranged on the stalk. That's an important way to be able to tell this plant. It's got a fuzzy lower stem, but the best way to tell if you think you've got this, I will dig a hole and pull up some of the plant, and you'll know right away if you've got those rhizomes going everywhere. The leaves come off at an angle, and it's pretty distinct, and they're kind of tough leaves, not soft, and that angular formation is pretty distinct. Okay, and this is its look-alike, slender wheatgrass, and it looks a lot like slender wheatgrass. However, it doesn't act like slender wheatgrass. The quack grass is different in that in between the spikelets is usually 3 to 7 millimeters. On slender wheatgrass, it is greater than 7 millimeters in the middle of that inflorescence. So it might be a little less on the top and the bottom, but it usually will be greater in the middle of that inflorescence. Slender wheatgrass forms clumps. It's a bunch grass, and it doesn't have rhizomes, nowhere near to the extent that quack grass does. So again, pulling that plant up will tell you a lot about what you've got. There are some other characteristics that I read about with the floret not coming apart from the spikelet easily on quack grass, whereas it does on slender wheatgrass. So a few little things, but they look very similar and they can be very confusing. Ryegrass, perennial ryegrass is another one introduced that you can run into. And notice the way that it grows along the stalk. So as opposed to this, where it's kind of, if they were hands, they'd be almost facing each other. And this one, they're waving at us. Okay, see how that's arranged? A little bit different. It's got a little bit longer and more narrow spikelet. And it's very common in lawn grasses and mixes. And so it's very important for producers not to plant their pasture with a lawn mix. And it's happened and it's caused problems. This one has an ergot in it, or it can have an ergot in it that is like a fungus that will make animals sick when they graze it. And I think it's done for golf courses in the lower 48, so they don't have infestations of grasshoppers or other insects that would eat the grass. It keeps them off of it, but it also, if you plant it for a grazing animal, it will make them sick or even kill them. Beech wild rye is one that's very recognizable. This is one of my favorite plants. It is a conservationist in itself. It's a nice stout grass that likes well-drained soils, and so you will find it on the sides of roads that have been sanded all winter, and then the sand gets pushed off and sanded and plowed, and so it gets a nice sandy base on the side of the road, and this plant will grow there. It grows typically along our beaches, our coastal sandy areas and rocky areas. It is it actually forms dunes. So sand comes off the coast, carried by the wind, and the wind is slowed down by the grass. The wind drops its sand load, and the sand dunes will grow. It's pretty cool. And it's a great grazing grass for winter time. It's not a great grazing grass during the growing season. So this picture here can show what can happen. If it's grazed, it can expose sand and it doesn't react well to grazing. Whereas down here, this area used to look like this or worse. But with management as going to this, it's grazed in the winter time here, but not the summertime. So pretty great grass.
But 1 minute left.
Oh, nice blue-green leaves and is a large stout plant. Siberian wild rye, very similar, but it's got a droopy panicle. So I don't think it's going to be very common, but that's a good way to recognize that. Bluegrass is tough. I didn't go into identifying specific bluegrasses. It's got multiple florets and a spikelet, a small open panicle, sometimes reddish in color, no awns. That's kind of a good way. It's a short grass. Leaf tips are typically keeled, a good pasture grass. And if you're getting into identifying POAs, you're gonna need a good dissecting scope and some time. Blue joint grass is our most common grass here on the peninsula. It's distinct with one floret per spikelet, and it's got a tuft of hair at the base of that spikelet. It's a very tall grass and grows over 6 feet. Reed canary grass is a similar look alike. It's got a leaf that comes off at an angle, kind of like quack grass. It's got a stiff leaf. Its seed heads are well above the leaves. It stays green later in the fall. It grows tall. And as an aside, grazing animals love it. So if that's an option for helping control it, that's something to consider. It is a threat and will clog moving streams. So it's a problem here on the peninsula. Orchard grass has a somewhat similar panicle. It's a smaller grass, more of a turf grass with very folded leaves. Not much of a threat, I don't believe. And then we've got polar grass, which is similar. It can also be confused with the Calamagrostis. It's got some unique characteristics to its spikelet related to its glooms. Their glooms are unequal. This is a native species as well. So from this, maybe you can look at some of these grass species and at least recognize that maybe we covered them. So they are sometimes identifiable by looking at them with a little bit of knowledge. And that's what I had for you. Hope I made it in time.
All right, great. Thank you. So let's see. Does anybody have any questions at the moment?
And this is Catherine. I'm jumping in for Maura as the chat monitor since she's queuing the videos. Karin, thank you so much for that presentation. That was super helpful. There was some chatter going on while you were presenting. So folks were asking if there had been cheatgrass found in Alaska, and the answer was occasionally. We know here on the Kenai Peninsula, it was located on the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center, but the Chugach National Forest and Betty Charnon's crew really worked with the Wildlife Center to eradicate it there. And Matt Bowser chimed in that a small patch of it was found on Skilock Lake Road in 2020, so last year. And then it looks like there are a few locations where quack grass has been found on the Kenai, and a lot of thank yous coming in. And Nicole just asked, do you usually find multiple species of grasses together in one patch, or do they tend to stick together in monocultures, basically in separate patches?
Yeah, that would probably depend on the species, but typically there are a lot of different species in a patch of grass, I would say, unless it's been planted or it's nasty invasive like quack grass.
Great, thank you. I have a question, which is I'm wondering if, given pandemic protocols, if you would be up for joining us for some field training this spring outside.
Yeah, that sounds like fun.
Great, wonderful. Also, I remember Maura and I scratching our heads looking at some hydro seed on a construction project on the Kenai Spur Highway a couple of years ago, looking at it in Alemus, and we were able to identify it as the native Alemus, but it's just a good heads up that it's in DOT's hydro seed mix, the native species. So that's a helpful one to learn how to distinguish, I think, between the Alemus repens, the quack grass.
Yeah, that's a tricky one for sure.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like there's one more question in the chat. Is there a very common seed ryegrass that is annual?
There is an annual ryegrass, yes. And I don't know how commonly it's used. Maybe others can chime in. I think probably they may use it a little bit for a cover crop maybe. And I would be willing to bet maybe DOT at some point has used it. It jumps up quickly and it's a good cover. But it's not the same beast as the perennial ryegrass for sure.
Oh yeah, Matt Bowser just chimed in that annual ryegrass is very abundant in roadside seed mix. Thanks, Matt. I think that's it for questions. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Visit KenaiInvasives.org to learn more.